Earlier, in the earlier part of the conversation, you mentioned that Indian domestic demand has always been resilient to crisis. You know,
Yeah.
but if we go back to 2008 or maybe 2091, I mean 29 was way too early. But if we go to the last few recessions, the main reason we were resilient was because we were not exposed to US markets or maybe international markets. But this time it's quite different. The domestic demand is at an all-time low because the work has been halted, the movement has been halted.
Yeah.
So do you think that the this crisis of the lockdown, firstly, will it be extended? If yes, what impact will it have on the domestic demand? I mean, not only pertaining to your business, but as an entrepreneur as well, what impact will it have on businesses?
Right. So, look, I think in most countries, it's taking between 3 to 4 months to flatten the curve. Right. Even in China, it took about 3 months to get to a point where the
You're
curve was
mentioning China
flattened. Right.
quite a bit. I'm coming to it here.
Right. So, I remain optimistic that we will be able to flatten the curve in a month, and we can start opening up some parts of the economy. Travel, to be honest, might be the last thing that gets opened because it's the most highest risk thing to open for the government, right? So I can empathize with that being the case, and even though we are at the receiving end of it, but maybe that's the hit to take in the interest of the nation. But the way I look at it is that, look, here are two or three things. One is that we have a very large segment of the population that works just to put food on the table, right? And for them, being at work every day and being able to give those hours of work is how they make sure they have any future at all, right? So for those people to get back to work, and obviously we are assuming that this opens up in a month and there is still a lot of places where they can work, right? Because that's also a great assumption at this point. But assuming that there are still opportunities for them to find work, and there is work available, those people do want to work, and they want to work maybe even doubly hard because they know that the businesses they were in have suffered a lot and they need to kind of do more in order to cope with it. So supply side, I'm not worried because bringing supply back online to 100%, most businesses will fight tooth and nail and get that done. It's the demand side which is more worrisome. So like you said, the shock maybe in other crises on the demand side might not have been that much. There may have been some funding shock in 2008, right? Financial crisis would have led to liquidity squeeze and less equity investments, debt investments, etc. But overall, the consumer was still buying things, and shops were still open, and travel was still on. So I think in that respect, this crisis is definitely very different. But one must remember that there are things that people want to do but are not able to at this point because either let's say non-essential e-commerce, right? Many people might have um, a laptop or a smartphone that doesn't work, but they can't even order a new one until things open up, right? So it's not like they will not do that. It's because they need to do that because it's probably an essential thing in their life. And we will start seeing as soon as e-commerce open up, demand on e-commerce starting to come back, right? Similarly, in other sectors where there is a utility use case, like I said earlier, even in travel, many parts of travel are related to a necessity of being at some other place, right? Now, if it's not, I'm not talking about leisure or corporate travel at this stage, right? So first leg is all about necessity and essential stuff. So I think that part opening up will give at least a ray of hope and confidence for the rest of the economy. Because right now, honestly, a lot of people might be losing that confidence, right? But
Right.
the moment you see some parts of the sector opening up, you will see a trickle down on other parts of the sector, right? Because if an office opens or if a shop opens, there are many other things around it that suddenly start functioning, right? And there are people
Mm-hmm.
dependent on, there might be a street vendor dependent on those shops opening. There might be many other informal
Sure.
economy parts that are dependent on it. So given the nature of that, I think that just the fact that we open up will lead to things bouncing back. V shape, U shape is a debate. I think I would say 2 to 3 quarters. It's what I'm hoping for most sectors. travel might be 3 to 4 quarters in terms of coming
I mean, I
back
remember
on
you
where
also
it was.
mentioned
Yeah,
earlier when we were
yeah,
having this conversation about a month ago when the crisis just started. You also
yeah.
mentioned that travel and tourism is the worst affected, but it might
Yes.
also be the one which will bounce back the fastest.
Yeah, look, there's something called revenge travel, right? I mean, people have this pent-up demand. People are dreaming of, being back on a plane and going to somewhere with their family, right? There are lots of, there's a whole graveyard of summer vacation plans out there, right?
Graveyard or summer vacations looks like a very dark term, but
Yeah,
maybe.
but there is, right? So a lot of summer vacation plans got killed, unfortunately. But you know what? I mean, we keep telling our kids that it didn't happen in summer, but don't worry, it's going to happen. Maybe in Diwali or Christmas for sure, right? And the reality is that people will, once the confidence level is established, and that's the iffy part. So I think there are two or three things are required. One is very aggressive kind of testing, at least for whenever we open up international, we may have to do on the spot COVID tests and all that for everybody going and coming. That might be essential. And very aggressive, I think this zoning that we are doing already, that's great because then, you're only opening up the green zones first and then the orange ones become green and all that. But thirdly is very essential to make sure that at least from a implementation of sanitization slash distancing slash the perception of being safe at, let's say, a railway station, at a bus station, at an airport, inside a plane, inside a train, inside a bus. If those things are implemented, I think that's what the confidence building measures, that's what I was talking about earlier, that if those things are in place, then people like me and you may think that it's worth the risk, right? Because maybe the risk is not that high anymore if everything is in place. So I think the more critical part in the short term is to put all those things in place before
Sure.
we open up, right? And I know that airlines are looking at how even within a bus that takes you to the aircraft, how you can only sit on alternate seats, or you can stand at only 2 meters apart, 1.5 meters apart, 2 meters apart, whatever the safety norm is. But it's going to be tough, right? It's going to, maybe you'll have to show up 3 hours earlier to the airport. Maybe you'll have to show up 2 hours earlier at the railway station and things like that. So those are the sacrifices
That
we'll
will
have to
be
make
the
as,
change in consumer behavior, I guess, going forward.
yes. But
But
in other sectors, like if you take any other sector of the economy, apart from travel and tourism, which everybody knows will take a little more time, I'm fairly optimistic because as long as people still have some jobs, right, which where I expect the government to play a role, because I think everyone has been asking for a much better stimulus package or financial support. And we've made several representations through industry bodies for travel and tourism specifically, because 10% of almost 10% of our GDP comes from travel and tourism,
mm,
right?
mm.
9% of the formal workforce works in travel and tourism, right? Or related, parts of
Allied.
the economy, allied parts of the economy. Now, for that industry to lose millions of jobs would be, a shame, because it will start impacting other. So if you look at places like Goa and Kerala, a very large part of the economy depends in
On
some
travel
way
and
or the
tourism.
other, yes,
Right.
on travel
That's
and
right.
tourism. So I'm expecting the state governments and central governments will come in and play a role to, help tour operators, travel agents, OTAs, in some way to, to play a role in reviving stuff, right? Because
So,
most people will require fiscal help, and also in other sectors, if this problem prolongs, right, we would need government intervention to avoid, a lot of businesses shutting down. Because if businesses shut down, then the hope of going back to a job fades away, and then what happens is the propensity to spend on anything actually drops, right? Because you're not even sure whether you'll have a job. So
when
I
it
think,
comes when it comes to demands from the government and
yeah,
fiscal stimulus package, every sector has their own demands. We can do an
yeah,
entire conversation on that. I mean, yesterday we
yeah,
spoke to Liberty, and they said that there should be a provision of EPFO funds being used by the employer to pay out to the Bihari Mazdoor, all the people who are belong to the low income group. But anyways, that's a different conversation
See,
altogether.
there are several ideas. Like in travel, we gave a very simple idea to the government, which was that, why don't you incentivize people to travel to the extent that up to, let's say, 2 lakh rupees a year, whatever you spend on flights, hotels, etc., can be a deductible from your taxes, right? Because that way nobody gets hurt, right? I mean, your objectives are met. You're boosting the economy. You're not really, requiring to inject any money to do it. You're just saying that, hey, anything you spend on travel will be
Mm.
deductible from your tax
And
calculation,
I'm
right?
sure we will get there, because we'll first have to deal with the crisis first and then probably think of the relief measures.
Yeah.
But yeah, many things happen simultaneously. Coming back to the last part of the conversation, we mentioned debt traps, we mentioned governments, and that brings us to China, of course. Your company has raised funds from the Chinese investors. Now, from an
Right.
entrepreneur standpoint, where do you see Chinese investments panning out in the country? Because China does have huge investments in the country, from TikTok to a lot of other platforms. I mean, a lot of payment walls. They're also trying to get the penetration to a lot of payment walls. Where do you
Right.
see Chinese investments panning out, especially after the COVID-19 crisis, where every Tom, Dick, and Harry is concerned about what is China, how is China, and made in China is a phobia now.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, bearing the, I'm not going to get into like the politics behind this, and some of this is
Trust me,
really
we
about,
had a conversation with Prabal Basu Roy about 2.5 weeks ago. We got a lot of comments and engagement on that particular subject
yeah.
only
Yeah.
on that
So,
subject.
here's my 2 cents, right? I think, in terms of where the rest of the world is in this crisis, there might be a lot to learn from China, right? And China might be willing to help as well. But the reality is that, given the early days of the crisis and the deep suspicion that, the complete information was not shared, even at the WHO level, etc. I think there is some mistrust that has seeped into, people's minds, and I think for the Chinese to actually overcome that would be to proactively maybe help, countries across the world who are dealing with the crisis right now. Um, in terms of recovery, I think there is so much to learn, because every time we have a conversation with some Chinese counterparts, the kind of measures that they like, most of the lifts in China now have a sticker, which you can scan in your WeChat app, right? And you can press a floor number and the lift will take you there. So it's a contactless, lift service. And they have modified, most of the existing lifts to support that. Now, small things like that, right? Which again, one can learn and quickly adapt, because those will be required when things open up, right? And I think since those guys are ahead of the curve in implementing everything,
Technology
and now
adoption.
they have a willingness to share that, and I think, one has to acknowledge that. But I think the government and the fear, I think in the minds of some of the business people here is that, at this point there might be some opportunistic investment takeovers, etc., and that is what has led to a knee-jerk reaction from the government. My take is very simple, that we are not at a stage in our economy where we can afford to say no to foreign capital, right? To any sort of foreign capital, because if you look at, our next gen companies, right, all the so-called unicorns or next gen internet startups, they are all built with, foreign capital coming in, right? And US might have been, the first source of capital, but today, China is now the second largest source of capital for Indian startups. So at least for the startup ecosystem and for technology intensive ventures, and who are raising maybe a minority round from a Chinese investor, the government might need to review how this thing works, right? Because like today, even if I need to do another round and my Chinese investors need to do a pro rata participation into it, they will need government approval, right, as per the current norms.
Mm.
But that doesn't sound right, given they are already invested in the company, right? So I think somewhere we'll have to find a middle ground where we are sure about the objectives of doing this, right? Because right now it looks like a knee-jerk reaction to anyone on the outside. But if the objectives are to protect some of our, incumbents, or to protect, some of our own companies, then maybe it's more to do with takeovers than with the small minority $5-10 million investments in startups, right? Because the latter is creating jobs, and it's helping to boost the economy, right? So unless we have our own deep pools of capital, right, we cannot say no to foreign
Sure.
pools of capital. And the reality is that India does not have yet a very deep pool of capital of its own.
Yeah, but I will try to play a devil's advocate here because we keep talking to a lot of people, and it's like if this reaction of the government is knee jerk, so was Chinese investors buying out stocks across companies in the world, especially Europe. In India, HDFC was one of the prime examples. So it was a knee jerk reaction to a knee jerk action as well. So there are all sides, and you're right. Middle ground needs to be reached, and middle ground is something if history has suggested as something that humans suck at reaching the middle ground. you know very fast.
Yeah, but I mean, my sense is that some of that is also maybe being exaggerated, because someone making opportunistic investment bets because company valuations are at all-time lows, right, can happen from any geography in the world, to be honest, right? But I think, given the rest of the perception that is being created, I can understand why people are reacting so much to Chinese investment. I believe the two governments have a lot of potential to, put their differences aside and work together, because now we are living in a world where uh, we have been shown that humans are not as invincible as we thought we were, right? And we should learn to collaborate rather than just compete all the time, because look at
Sure.
what we've done to the environment, and where things are now. So I think if we can find a more collaborative framework with China, right now is a great time to find it. And maybe the Chinese can help to the extent that they can show their willingness to help
Sure.
to whatever extent. And I think that means we also need to be a lot more open.
ओपन एंड कोलैबोरेटिव फ्रेमवर्क, दैट्स द की टेक अवे. आलोक बाजपेयी जी, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद हमसे बात करने के लिए.
Thank
थैंक यू
you.
सो मच फॉर योर टाइम.
Take
दिस
care.
वाज एक्चुअली इंसाइटफुल, एंड थैंक यू वेरी मच.